Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and as of me recording this, today was game day. And it went weird, but not in a bad way. Because I drop 2 videos a week, that means that on Sundays, we tend to play 2 game sessions. We do the first one from around 1 o'clock in the afternoon until 3. And then we break for about an hour. We take an intermission. And then once that's over, we play a completely different game than usually from 4 to 6. But between today's gaming and last week, my son had started to notice some things, and he actually had a ton of questions about the game world, and it reminded me of pointillism. And I know that I've mentioned pointillism on the channel before, but it's been a while, and I'm guessing that not everybody who's listening to this episode has heard every episode, so I'm going to really quickly just kind of go over the idea of pointillism again. So sometimes when you go to an art museum and you walk in, maybe it's like a huge room, and against the wall where you go in, there are these colored dots, right? And they might seem random and meaningless. Then you follow the walls of the room around to the opposite side of the room, and there's usually like a little plaque or something like that explaining what pointillism is and telling you to now turn around and look at those dots again. And because you're on the far side of this gigantic room, you can now literally see the big picture. And all those dots were part of this one gigantic painting, right? Well, likewise, I think a single RPG adventure can be like those dots. By itself, it might seem more simple than it really is, or it might even seem to be pointless. But if you take a step back and you look at all of the adventures at once and how they all work together, then you see the big picture of the game world and its history and the themes that we're exploring, so on and so forth. So today, for the first time in a long while, my players took a step back and they kind of saw all the dots at once and they saw the bigger themes and bigger story arcs than they had really appreciated before. And by the way, I get it, right? For the player, it doesn't there's not much of a thing of being too close to see it than being inside of the adventure itself, right? It can be really hard to kind of step back and look at things from that different perspective. So in these rare moments when that happens, I'm just happy that they are sort of seeing what I've been painting, so to speak. And at the risk of sounding pretentious, I did go to art school and I have been an art teacher in the past. So I really do think of myself as an artist. But sometimes when I say that to people, they kind of like roll their eyes. But if you really think about it, seriously, aren't we all artists? Like, sure, we all go to some sort of a job to make money, to pay the bills because we have to, right? But beyond that, don't we all have something left over? Don't we all have something bigger within us that we feel like we somehow have to express? And at the end of the day, isn't that what art truly is, right? So so I feel less um self-conscious, I guess, about calling myself an artist if I'm calling everybody an artist. And I think we are, and I think that role-playing games are, and I've said this for years, I think of them as sort of like a form of sculpture. You're kind of sculpting this game world, right? But instead of working with clay or marble or whatever, it's a sculpture of the mind. You know what I mean? It's conceptual sculpture. And I've always thought that role-playing games are a more valid art form than people really give them credit for. And so then that kind of brings me to the next thing I wanted to say. Um, So my good friend Tim passed away this year, and his funeral was yesterday. And when he died, I spent several weeks thinking about a lot of different things. And one of those things was my own mortality. The idea that one day I too would be gone. And it made me think about what I would leave behind, you know? And it made me think about how many hours do I have left on this planet? Maybe hundreds, maybe thousands, I don't know. And then I was thinking about, how am I actually going to spend those hours? And in the case of me specifically, a lot of that time is going to be spent on this game. And that's significant. I've been playing this game for 40 years, and it appears that I'm going to keep playing this game for the rest of my life. And so this game is one of those few things that I'm going to leave behind. So if all I ever do is run games that are mindless hack and slash, then that would feel like a waste to me. Likewise, if all I did was parrot the stories that other people have already told, that also feels like a waste, right? I feel like if I'm going to do this, I'd better put my own unique spin on things. Otherwise, why bother? And I'd argue that the differences between what I do and what others do is what makes this my art. So, from that point of view, I was really happy today that my players kind of just took an entire game session worth of time to just kind of take a step back and admire my art. Sometimes it's just nice to be seen. Anyway, so instead of playing two games today, that first block of time was just me and the players talking about the game world. And I explained the entire last year of gaming as kind of our prologue. And I did it at great length, answering not only what their characters would know in game, but also out of game. I was revealing my thoughts and my reasons for doing the things that I do and the themes that we explore. So that was all really nice. Which reminds me, to really appreciate today's game, I have to explain a concept that was tackled really well by an old book called The Gamer's Bible, in which they took the concept of a character class from Dungeons and Dragons, but they applied it to the players themselves. So one class was the loot goblin, and that is the player who is maybe less into combat or less excited about leveling up, and instead the thing that they are really into is treasure. Like they really want to write down how many gold pieces they found or how many rubies there were in the adventure, or if they found a silver dagger, what is its value? And my wife, for instance, I think is the loot goblin of our circle of gamers, right? And then there's the guy who only cares about combat. He doesn't like detective work, he doesn't like riddles, he doesn't like characterization or any of that other stuff. All he really wants to do is beat stuff up. I used to know a guy named Matt, and he for sure filled that role in our circle of friends, right? And as for me, I was what the book referred to as the Xerox. In other words, I had played games long enough that I'd done a little bit of everything and I'd figured out what I liked. And so I would, at the end of the day, that one thing that I was into, I would do that thing over and over and over again, right? Longtime followers of the podcast, by the way, are probably going to see a lot of examples of that in my game, right? They can tell where I keep repeating myself with a certain character. And I'm not the only Xerox in our gaming group. Brad, who's been with us for about a year now, is a Xerox also. And something that he recently told me is that he likes to make a character who either is him or who, at the very least, represents him. kind of like in the same way that the fictional character of Tom Sawyer represented his creator, Samuel Clemens, right? Mark Twain. And so I was no stranger to that concept. In our game, there was a hero named Powerhouse who was basically supposed to be me, but with superpowers. And his wife is the Earthborn Angel of Fire, right? The 90s Supergirl. And she is not only played by my wife, but she is in game supposed to literally be my wife, right? And then our son plays Powerhouse II. And then, his fictional counterpart in the game is then the son of me and my wife's fictional counterparts, right? So in today's game session, those were the party members. And we were all basically playing ourselves for a change. And Brad was playing Killfrost, which in real life was his call sign when he was in the Marine Corps. But remember how I said Brad was a Xerox and he would play more or less the same character over and over and over again? Well, so this time last year, we were playing some games that were set at the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters, and he played a character named Axel. And he put a lot of himself into that character too. But due to some early miscommunications between me and Brad, Axel kept ending up in these situations where he seemed like a villain. And I don't want to get too into it, but Brad himself in real life has gone through a lot of changes over the last few years, right? So I pitched the idea to him several weeks ago that maybe the reason why Killfrost and Axel both coexist is because maybe Axel is kind of like the evil counterpart to Killfrost. So when the adventure began, we were all playing superhero versions of ourselves, and we were in the Hollow Earth. This picks up exactly where the last game left off, And they had this character there named Trinity, who was created by Atlanteans to be sort of like a living computer. And Trinity has this interesting ability to transform a person into their previous version. So the original Powerhouse was given his Kryptonian powers back. He had lost those powers in an old adventure when he fought a variant of Dr. Manhattan, who in turn had exposed Powerhouse to gold kryptonite. Anyway, so everybody's standing around Steve Trevor talking about, if we use this thing on Steve Trevor, can it sort of like unmake a Red Lantern ring? Can it give Steve Trevor his blood back? Because that was one of these concepts with the Red Lanterns is when you become a Red Lantern, your blood leaves your body and is replaced by something that the ring is doing. I would assume it's like the force manipulation power is taking the place of the blood. So then the idea is if you do manage to get the ring off of a person, that's lethal, right? And they didn't want to do that. So while they're all standing around talking about this, Axel shows up. And Axel recognizes Powerhouse because Powerhouse was Axel's teacher at the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. So Axel gets a surprise attack, and he attacks Powerhouse in the back with his fire powers. Axel also rolls doubles. And we pointed out, by the way, that Axel had no idea. He was never told that Powerhouse ever used to have Kryptonian powers, right? So in this moment, when he did it, what was implied was that Axel thought it would kill Powerhouse, right? I feel like that's worth kind of taking a beat to point out that his intentions here were really sinister, right? And that would have killed Powerhouse if not for the fact that Trinity just now gave him his old powers back. So now Powerhouse has a body of 40. And Axel would need to roll more doubles than he did before the fire would actually burn Powerhouse himself. As it stands, the only thing that got burnt was Powerhouse's costume. Then, when it was my wife's turn, she flies up to Axel, and she was also a teacher at the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. So, on her turn, she hugs him and she asks him, "What's wrong? Like, what on earth has gotten into you? Why are you doing this?" And by the way, also to be clear, Brad was playing both Axel and Killfrost in this adventure. And on Killfrost's turn, he yells, "Sivana!" And he is transformed into a super powered version of himself. Axel then mocks Killfrost by saying Sivana, and then Axel is struck by this black bolt of lightning, which transforms him into a superpowered version of himself, right? So now Axel is kind of like the Black Adam to Brad's Shazam. So then Axel takes another shot at Powerhouse, this time shooting him with some of that lightning, right? Then Killfrost tells Axel to calm down or he's going to get hurt. And Killfrost ends up punching Axel. And he hits him so hard that the knockback damage sends Axel about 236 miles through the skies of Skartaris. And then Axel and Brad just start slugging it out. And I thought that was really interesting. For me personally, I was reminded of that scene in Superman 3 back in the 80s when they're in the junkyard and we see the Christopher Reeve Superman has been corrupted, and then he has to face off against Clark Kent, who is, of course, also played by Christopher Reeve, right? And the Clark Kent in this scene is more like pure of heart, basically. Anyways, so while in game, it was Axel versus Brad, really for me, this metaphor represented the Brad of today, in how he sort of hates the man he used to be and how his nature now is at odds with what he was a few years ago. Does that make sense? And by the way, in our game, Killfrost is roughly twice the age of Axel. Axel's around 20, give or take a little, and Killfrost is like around 40, give or take a little. And one thing that also made this interesting, to me at least, was that then when the game was over, afterwards, Brad hung around for a couple of hours and we had this long talk just about stuff that's going on in our life, And I don't want to tell you what it was because that would be, too personal for a podcast, of course. It'd be inappropriate. But I thought it was interesting that, I think all of us struggle sometimes with ourself, right? That there's some kind of inner turmoil. And so he'd gone through some stuff recently. So it was like ironic that the game was like kind of about that. You know what I mean? So getting back on topic, suffice it to say, I thought the Axel versus Brad thing was just very interesting. And in game, Brad kept landing hits while Axel kept fumbling the dice and making mistakes. And Axel was so full of rage, he had tears in his eyes. And he screams at his old teachers that they failed him. And then Axel opens a portal into his own personal dark dimension, which I never thought about it until just now, actually. But even that is kind of like a cool metaphor, right? And so then he sort of fled into that. He retreated into darkness. The heroes return to where Trinity is, but now the Red Lantern, aka Steve Trevor, is no longer there. And they have no idea where he went or who took him. And that was it. And then we get to the epilogue. And that was just a brief recap of Brad and Axel's stories with kind of a comparison and contrast thing going on. So we talked about how Axel had gone to the Xavier school, and when he first showed up, he was already in police custody. And when he met Powerhouse, he referred to him as an old man. And like Axel already had a chip on his shoulder from day one. And yes, he was a victim of the system, but how he played the hand he had been dealt led him down the path to villainy, right? Conversely, Killfrost was a soldier. He'd been injured in the line of duty. And then the VA dropped the ball and they passed him off to LexCorp, who turned him into an OMAC against his will. Brad was in the OMAC squad that destroyed the Rock of Eternity, which took away the powers of the Marvel family. And ironically, in the end, Brad now has the powers of the Marvel family. And the way he played the hand he had been dealt has led him down the path of heroism, right? In the end, Axel decided, even though he tried to kill Powerhouse, in the grand scheme of things, Powerhouse and Earth Angel were actually really never that bad to him, right? But ironically, it was Killfrost who had done the most damage in this game session. And it was Killfrost that he hated the most now. And it was Killfrost that he swore he would get revenge against. So I thought that was very interesting. And again, the theme of the whole game was basically that, the man Brad is today is the enemy of who Brad used to be. Right. And for me, anyways, I found that to be a very relatable theme. Anyways, so we liked how it went today. Hopefully you liked hearing about it. If so, as always, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. And from all of us here at the longest running superhero role-playing game on Earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure.